Here's what we learn how to make in this video. Hello there, my inspirations. My name is Inspirasper. Before we get into the video, I just wanted to take a quick second to announce that my first ever EP, Dreamland, is coming out November 3rd. I believe that's 1 week after this video is released. If you like what I do and you want to support my work, consider checking that out. Okay, so the goal of this video is to teach you how to make your first song in Ableton Live 10. I've made something similar in the past, but admittedly it was a bit outdated. So I wanted to take some time to more or less remake that video with some newfound knowledge and teach you how to make your first song from scratch. I'm setting some ground rules for myself. I will only be using default Ableton plugins, just the stock instruments, audio effects that come with Ableton. No third-party plugins whatsoever. Also, I'm gonna do my best to use instruments and audio effects that are new to Ableton Live 10 compared to Live 9. That way I can actually make this video be a little bit different and again, more modern and up to date. So without wasting any more time, let's jump into it and learn how to make our first song. You'll see here before me I have an empty Ableton session. This is just the default layout when you open up a new Ableton session. File, new live set. I'm gonna hit the tab key on my keyboard to switch to the arrangement view. From here, by default, you'll see 2 MIDI tracks and 2 audio tracks. To sum it up short and sweet, MIDI tracks are where we're gonna draw in our notes that instruments can play. Audio tracks will be used to play samples. First things first, I like to set the BPM of my song. Just kind of give a rough ballpark estimate. And then from there, I can kind of alter it to my liking. For now, I'm feeling maybe something around 80 BPM. The lower the number, the slower the song. The higher the number, the faster. Next, I want to start by making some chords. This is just a personal preference. I like to start with the chords and build from there. To make some chords, I first need to make a MIDI clip. To do this, I'm going to left click and drag for however long I want within a MIDI track. In this case, this is 17 bars long. To make the MIDI clip, I'm gonna right click on my highlighted area and select Insert MIDI Clip. You should see this piano roll pop up. If you don't, be sure to double click your MIDI clip. From here, I can click right about here. My cursor will make this symbol, which allows me to click and drag upwards to expand the piano roll. I can press the B button on my keyboard to switch to the draw mode. You'll see this pencil pop up, and I can draw in some notes. But if I hit play, the space bar, nothing happens. That's because I don't have any instrument assigned. So what I need to do is go over into my Ableton library and pick an instrument. To do this, I'm gonna go under Instruments and select my instrument under these drop-down menus. A new instrument to Ableton Live 10 specifically is the wavetable. So let's pretend I want to use the wavetable instrument. To do that, I'm gonna left click and drag and drop onto my MIDI track. I'm gonna go back into my piano roll again by double clicking. And now if I hit play, quick tip, if you want to hear the sounds of your notes as you click on them, say for example, you can do so by clicking this button right here. By default, it's grayed out. Click it, it turns blue. Now every time you draw on a note, you can hear that sound. Just something to consider. Great, so at this point, I can now start to make my chords. Writing chords, I feel like is out of scope for this video. That's more or less a topic for another day. But for now, I'm just gonna whip up some quick notes just to get the point across. Okay, so I've gone ahead and created a chord progression that I'm happy with for the sake of this video. A few things that I did was that I just made some chords. They hit every bar, except for at the end, I have them hitting every half bar. And I also changed my BPM. What I'm trying to get across here is that nothing's necessarily locked in stone, say my BPM. I can change that anytime if I'm not necessarily feeling it. Also, get creative with your chords. You don't necessarily have to have them hit every bar. You can change up a pattern, maybe have them hit every quarter. Maybe you can have them hit in fifths. In fact, yeah, that's something I kind of like, so I'm gonna keep that. So yeah, I made it so that these are fifths, so now 5 chords hit in every bar. And then at the end here, I actually changed that pattern and I did a quarter followed by eighths. The takeaway here, I think, is that while music theory is important and good to know, also the rhythm is very important too. Just because you have something that sounds nice doesn't mean it's catchy, and potentially vice versa. So this is a chord progression I'm happy with, and for the most part, I just want this to loop. One thing you can do is you'll notice there's a bar up here. I can click and drag. I'm gonna move this to the left, and I'm gonna drag this right end over to the end. And actually for now, I'm just gonna go ahead and delete this end bit, this tail, that's not really needed. So one thing I can do is I can right click this bar and select loop. So now I can press play. And you'll notice that it loops through this MIDI clip. Now, again, here's another thing that's kind of out of scope of this video, is just straight up sound design. That's kind of a beast in itself. So for the sake of, again, moving this video along, what I'm gonna do is just use a preset that I like. You can find presets by going under instruments and then under any of these subcategories. So for example, maybe I like the wavetable. It's new to Ableton Live 10, at which point I can look for some sounds that I like. Okay, I found a preset that I like under mallets, fizz bells. Sounds pretty good to me. Now let's give our track some bass, something to go underneath these chords. To do this, I'm gonna go ahead and copy this MIDI clip and paste it onto a different MIDI track. And now that we have two layers of our song, I'm gonna go ahead and rename these tracks just to kind of organize our project a little bit. So over here, this Fizzbells track, I just wanna rename that. I'm gonna right click and select rename. I'm gonna name this Flux. And then this number 2 track, the MIDI, I'm gonna rename that to bass. And I like to color these accordingly, just again, for the sake of organization. Right click and I can select a color. And for now, I'm actually just gonna go ahead and delete these 2 audio tracks. Just left click on them and press the delete button. Okay, so now on to making our bass. I don't want any chords for my bass. I just want one single note to play. And the note that I want to play is actually gonna be the roots of my chords. So I'm gonna go into my bass layers MIDI clip and just delete all of the notes in each chord except for the bottom. I just want the last note on the stack. This is the root, and playing this alongside of the chords should make a sound that I am pretty happy with. Now I need to assign a bass instrument to my MIDI track. I think maybe this one will be good. Let's try this out. So one thing happened there that I'm not particularly happy with. One thing you should always keep your eye on is the volume level of your master track. The master track is the overall sound, so what you hear when you press play, all of the layers combined. If you look down here, there's a layer called master. If I hit play right now, there's kind of an issue. This went into the red. This is called clipping. So basically it went over the desired threshold, and we don't want that. Some ways to get around clipping are to adjust the volumes of your layers or to EQ them accordingly, which we'll get into in just a minute. But the point is, I think this bass layer is just a little bit too loud. So I could either lower the volume of this bass layer, or I could look for a different instrument, which I think I'm just gonna do anyways. Okay, so I found a bass that I like, but this one actually is more or less just a sub bass. This is under operator, bass, bass sign like. Now this is defined as a sub bass because it only takes up such low frequencies. And I actually kind of like that, so I think I'm gonna keep it. Now if you'll notice, if I hit play, again, I'm clipping a little bit, and actually it looks like my plucks are pretty loud too. So I kind of want to lower the volume of each of these tracks, and then I'll EQ them so they fit in later. But in order to lower the volume of your tracks, just go over here where you see this 0, click and drag, and you can lower it. I'm gonna keep this to about -2 decibels, essentially just a little bit quieter. I'm also gonna do the same with my bass, maybe lower it just a little bit. I am still clipping, but that's okay, not to be worried. I'll be sure to clean up the mix a little bit to make sure that's fine. Okay, so this layer of bass covers a lot of the low end frequencies, but now I also want to cover some of the more mid-range. It's nice to have the rumble of the sub bass, but I also want another layer on top of it. So to do that, I'm gonna rename this layer to sub bass. I'm gonna copy it, paste it, rename the second layer to maybe a mid bass. For this one, I want to find another instrument, something that maybe sounds a little bit grittier, kind of hefty. Okay, this one sounds kind of good, at least for what I'm trying to do. For my own organization's sake, and also for some other reasons I'll get into in a little bit, I want to group these two together. To do that, I'm gonna click right here, hold the Shift key, and then select my other MIDI track, at which point I can right-click and select Group Tracks. This creates a group, so the two tracks are now bundled together. I can now rename this to bass. Now what I want to do is EQ my layers a little bit. EQing essentially lets me cut off certain ranges of frequencies that the sound takes up. And if you do it right, it can make your layers fit together like puzzle pieces. To find EQing, we can go under Audio Effects and go to EQ. I'm gonna use an EQ8 for the sake of this video. You can left click and drag your audio effect and drop it onto your MIDI track. So this is on my layer of sub bass, and for now, I only want to listen to this track. To do that, I'm gonna solo this track by left clicking right here at this S button. Now if I hit play, I only hear this track. If you look down here, you'll notice that this is the audio waveform of this track. And for the most part, I really only want frequencies below, I don't know, something like 100, maybe 150 for this sub bass. I'm gonna click one of these drop down buttons and select this guy right here. This creates a low pass filter where I can set the frequency cutoff range. I can do that by left clicking and dragging this little circle or by moving this frequency knob. What this says is anything above 188 Hertz will not be played. It'll just be cut out of the mix. And so I'm gonna do what I said and more or less just go about 100, maybe 120. You can hear the difference if I toggle this low pass filter on or off. You should hear some frequencies being cut out there when this low pass filter is active. I'm actually gonna change some of these notes a little bit, by the way. So I raised these notes over here by an octave because it didn't really sound good with the sub bass. It was too low. Now I want to do the same thing with my mid-range bass. So I'm gonna solo this track and add an EQ filter onto it. Now I'm gonna create a high pass filter, so the opposite of a low pass filter, cuts off anything below it. I'm gonna set that at about where my sub bass cuts off. So in this case, maybe 111-ish. And then I also want to create another low pass filter. This time I'm looking for one maybe around 400. This is all really subjective. It kind of depends on your specific mix. I'm gonna go ahead and lower the notes by an octave again. To make our bass really stand out in this mix, I'm actually gonna put another EQ on our bass group as a whole, and then put a low pass filter at about 400. So just really make sure that it's cut off right there. And then I'm gonna put an EQ on our layer of plucks, put in a high pass filter at that same exact cutoff. So it's more or less saying anything below 400 belongs to our basses, anything above belongs to our plucks. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with that. Now let's throw in some drums into the mix. To do this, I want to make another MIDI track. I can right click in this empty space and select Insert MIDI Track. Next, I'm gonna go under Drums, Drum Rack, and drag that onto that MIDI track. I need to make a MIDI clip, and then now, if I left click on this MIDI track, you can see this grid of squares. This is where I can drag in drum kick samples to be played. Let's look under Ableton's default drums to see what there is. Go under Drum Hits, and let's go for some kicks, and just find a sample that I like. I kind of like this sample, but I don't really like the end of it. But that can be fixed. So I'm gonna drag this into our drum rack, and I'm gonna move these start and end flags just to the parts that I want. Maybe have it fade out a little bit. That sounds nice. So now I can go into my piano roll, and you'll notice that my sample's right here. So I can draw in a kick pattern. So this is what I drew up. Some things you can do here to spice up your drums are to add in some audio effects onto your kick layer. So maybe an EQ. If you go to EQ8 drums, Ableton provides some good default kick EQing. Another thing we can do is sidechaining. This makes the volume of other tracks dip every time this kick plays. You can do that by going to Audio Effects, Compressor, and drag that onto, let's say, our overall bass layer. Now you'll see there's a compressor. If I select this arrow, sidechain, and then go to drum rack, let's actually rename that to kicks. Now you'll see that it is sidechained to the kicks. I can click this button right here and move this knob to somewhere around here. Now if I hit play, our bass is being sidechained, and we can see that by clicking right here. The orange bar represents the volume, so every time this kick plays, adjusting this circle right here is a way of adjusting how much you want it to actually sidechain. Let's say that's a good level of ducking. What I can do is copy this compressor and paste it onto our pluck layer. It really makes our kicks shine, kind of pops through the mix. Next, let's add in some snares to complement the kicks. Let's right-click, insert MIDI track, add in a drum rack, and then find some snares under drums, drum hits, and let's go to snares. Now, I actually found two samples that I like, so let's drag them both into this drum rack and then make a MIDI clip, and let's draw them both in whenever I want a snare to play. Point is, what I'm trying to say here is you can actually stack the samples. You can play them at any point, maybe even on top of each other. Let's rename this to snares, and I'm actually gonna group my kicks and snares together and call this percussion, just for the sake of organization. Now the snares are kind of bland. There's some things that you can do to spice them up, including maybe adding in some EQing, which already sounds a little bit better. Maybe we can add in things like a glue compressor, maybe to make it a little bit less harsh. Knowing your audio effects and what they do is another element by itself, more or less. For the sake of time, let's pretend this is good enough. I also want the other layers of my song to be sidechained to my snares. Let's do the same thing we did for the kicks, but this time sidechained to our snares layer. In fact, let's just copy this compressor and paste it right next to it, this time switching the sidechaining audio from kicks to the snares. Let's maybe have it duck a little bit more. Seems good to me. Let's copy this, paste it onto our plucks. At this point, you can also add in things maybe like some hi-hats or some cymbals. So let's make another MIDI track with a drum rack on top of it. Let's find some hi-hats. I found some hi-hats I like, at which point I can draw in a pattern of hi-hats that I want. Okay, let's say that's a pattern that I like. Let's also add in some cymbals. I just made a very simple pattern like this. Seems good to me. Let's also EQ this one like we did for the other layers of the percussion. And maybe adjust the volumes of each element, so maybe the hi-hats are a little bit too loud. Maybe these are also a little bit too loud. Maybe let's also add in some reverb. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with that. Maybe let's also add in another layer of chords to complement our plucks. I'm just gonna copy and paste what I already have for the plucks onto a different MIDI track. Let's try and find a different instrument that we might like for that. I found a pad layer that I like under Operator, Pad, and Glacier Voices. I'm gonna rename this to Wide Pad. Let's group these two together. I'm actually gonna get rid of the sidechain on each individual layer and just put it on the overall group. Let's add in another pad just for the sake of making the mix just a little bit wider. I found this pad that's kind of interesting. Again, under Operator, Pad. This time it's called Still Sky. Maybe I want to lower the volume of this just a little bit. But as you can more or less put together at this point, I'm just kind of adding elements on top of each other, just stacking layers. But maybe let's also add in a different layer. Maybe I want to add in a melody. So let's add in a layer of leads. I'm picturing my leads to be something xylophony, so I found this brushed bell hits bell, I guess, under operator mallets. Let's drag that on. And now let's get to writing a melody. Okay, so I whipped up a melody real quick here, and I'm gonna do the same thing for what I did with these pads. Just more or less stack a lot of layers that I'm happy with, that I kind of want to work together in harmony. Okay, so I have a few that I'm happy with. I stacked guitar, I guess sitar guitar over here, and the FM1 short lead. And this is what it sounds like. Melodies are another thing I'm chalking up as more or less something I can't cover in this video. They're kind of a thing of their own, but the one tip I will give is to stay in key, and also, again, as I mentioned before with the chords, music theory is important, but also so is rhythm. You have to kind of balance the two. I'm gonna group these together as I did before with everything else. And I'm gonna get to balancing each of these. I like how they sound together, but maybe not at their current volumes. I'm gonna throw some audio effects on our overall group, maybe an EQ, again, maybe some compressors for the sake of sidechaining, but I'm actually gonna lessen up on these ones just because they're the leads and I want them to kind of lay over top the whole mix, but I still do want a little bit of sidechaining in there. Maybe I can add in some reverb, maybe some delay of sorts, maybe a glue compressor at the end of it all to kind of tie everything together. And at this point, I'm noticing certain elements are maybe getting drowned out. For example, our cymbals. So it's at this point where you'd kind of go back and tinker with everything, adjust the volumes. Again, nothing is ever really set in stone as soon as you make it. You're allowed to go back and adjust things. Okay, so I just went back and I added another layer of plucks. I adjusted some volumes, just a little bit of tweaks here and there. So we have a nice loop here, and that's fine and dandy, but to turn it into an actual song, we'd need to extend it. Maybe actually it has to be a full-length song, so 3 minutes or so. Point is, it can't really just be 20 seconds. So I'm gonna move this loop right here. I'm just gonna left click and drag, and I'm gonna copy this and paste it over here. At which point maybe I wanna delete over this as well. So now let's make a transition, maybe a quick intro that kind of builds up and plays into this little loop that we made. Maybe I wanna copy over the pads, for example, and just kind of paste them over here. Maybe I want them to be able to fade in. One thing I can do in Ableton 10 is switch to automation mode by pressing A, at which point you'll see a lot of these red lines appear. Let's automate the volume of our overall chords group track. I can do that by left clicking the volume, and you'll notice this red line appeared. I can automate this, which means I can change its value over time. And so maybe I want it to slowly fade in. One thing I can do is left click and select an anchor point right here, and then let's set another one at the beginning. Now at this point I'm gonna left click and drag it down, and you'll notice that I've lowered this to -10 decibels. Now if I were to hit play and watch the volume over here, it's currently changing over time. Some things you can do from here are add in some more breakpoints to adjust the automation. You can hold the Alt key, and that selects this entire line, at which point you can left click and drag, and that creates a slope. So let's have it slowly fade in. Let's do the same thing with our melody, actually. I'm gonna copy and paste this over here, except I only want it to come in right about here. But I'm gonna do the same thing with the volume. I'm just gonna automate it. Another thing I can do potentially is automate a low pass filter. So let's add a low pass filter right here. Maybe I just want to cut off something really high, like 16,000. What I can do is I can click this knob and automate that as well. So if I were to set a breakpoint right here, and then maybe right here I can have it be lower, I can essentially have this EQ filter automate over time. Let's get rid of some of these layers. And then finally, let's wrap it up by adding in a transition sound effect. Let's right click over here and insert audio track. Let's go over under drums, maybe find a ride. This one sounds pretty good to me, something long. Let's drag it onto our audio track. Let's double click it and actually hit this button right here. This reverses the sample. Now if I were to hit play. Now it's sounding a little bit weird, and that's because it's warped. One thing I also want to do is unclick this button right here. It says warp. Now let's zoom in and drag this right over here. And so now I have a very basic transition sound effect, but I feel like it's coming in maybe a little too soon. So let's drag this over by left clicking the end over here, dragging it, and let's hit the A button to leave automation mode. At which point, when I hover over this sound effect, you'll notice there's 4 squares that show up on each corner. Let's left click this one and drag it in. This controls the volume of the sound effect. So essentially it's slowly coming in, it's fading in over time. I can move this little icon right here to change the slope of the line. Finally, let's right click, insert audio track. Let's add in one more ride, a cymbal sound effect at the beginning of this loop. So it kind of rises up into this reverse cymbal, but then it also crashes as soon as this loop starts. This sounds good to me. Let's make sure this isn't warped as well. Let's maybe lower the volume of this real quick. And I think that should do it. That's, you know, the very basics of making your first song. What you do at this point is more or less just take what you just learned and kind of extend that to make an entire full-length track. You'd then also have to export your song, which you can do by going to File, Export Audio and Video, and then you'd also have to make sure that your track is mastered. That's another process in of itself. But there you have it. That's pretty much it. That's the basics of making your first song. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you learned something. Consider checking out my new EP coming out November 3rd. Very excited for that to come out, and thanks for watching.